Joining me now is Matthew Lesh from the Adam Smith Institute, all the way from Australia. Hi, Matthew.
Great to be here.
Now, Matthew, can I ask you, why is the Adam Smith Institute advocating that the United Kingdom put in place a Free Speech Act modelled on the First Amendment of the United States of America?
Well, as you very well know, Darren, freedom to express ourselves is fundamental to who we are as humans, and it's also fundamental to free and democratic political debate. But as you've personally experienced, and many others have, for far too long, our laws have been used by people who want to censor speech. We've created an effective heckler's veto in the law, where you can claim to be offended, you can claim that certain speech is unacceptable, that it's distressing, that it's hateful, and then you can use the organs of the state, the power of the state, to censor speech. Now, this is very perverse. We have spent literally hundreds of years, dating back to the Magna Carta, trying to use the law to secure our liberty, to limit the power of the king. But now we've empowered the state to basically censor people. And you've got cases like yours with David Starkey. You've got Count Dracula and his shocking case where he posts a comedic video and gets fined for that. And we've even many, many more that we don't know about. We've got the London Met have reported that 400 people arrested in London alone over the last 5 years for communicating in an offensive nature, sending an offensive message or false information, as well as additional threats. So the reason why we think a Free Speech Act is important and necessary is because we want something akin to what they have in the United States, which is a First Amendment kind of situation where all speech is protected from government interference. And the reason why you need this is to ensure that two reasons. One, to ensure that free speech is fully protected, but also ensure that unintentionally laws are put in place that limit free speech, which is what's happened in the UK with things like the Communications Act or the malicious communications
Public
laws.
Order Act.
Exactly.
But yes, the report argues that the poor drafting of existing law means that as social attitudes shift, the categories of what is and isn't, the parameters of what is and isn't acceptable speech are becoming increasingly narrow. And, if I say, oh, Matthew Lesh has tweeted something I find offensive, distressing or hateful, I can report you to the police quite easily.
That's absolutely right. So even if it wasn't the original intention of the drafters of the law, the way the courts have chosen to interpret laws over time is in an increasingly expansive manner, to the point where it is fundamentally true that you can go to the police and report someone for what you perceive to have been a hateful comment. We've got to question whether or not we now need a Free Speech Act to counteract that. So we're actually calling for two things. One, we want to remove the kind of problematic sections of the existing laws, like the Public Order Act, like the Malicious Communications Act, that contain words like insulting and abusive, that have been really expansive in their legalistic interpretation, whilst leaving genuine, protection for speech that wouldn't be accepted anywhere. So speech which is actually threatening, speech which is harassment, speech which is malicious defamation. These are all protected categories of law. So these are all unprotected categories of speech everywhere in the world, and that would remain the case in the UK. But what we're saying is that we should have a far more expansive idea of what is acceptable speech, and we should have a clear law that says both to the courts that you can't infringe on speech, and also to the state. So, for example, if a quango would be interfering on somebody's speech in some way, let's say the Advertising Standards Authority was saying you can't make a certain claim in public, as has been the case this year on something like masks. So you can make that as a free speech argument and say that quango is interfering with our free speech to say that masks might actually be effective, which turned out to be the later public health advice. So we think it's really important to have an overall protection of free speech, which doesn't currently exist in the UK law.
What do you say to those, Matthew, who are critical of this for one reason and one reason only, and that is that they moan and groan at the idea that what we need are new laws, when actually, we saw this when the cenotaph was attacked. Actually, people were saying, the Home Secretary came out and said, well, what we really need is new laws. And everyone said, well, hang on a minute. What we actually need is our existing law to be applied non-selectively, essentially. And aren't we seeing that with free speech and with these different types of Public Order Act, whether that be the whatever law you want to select? It's the law itself that's been applied in either a disproportionate or a selective way.
Look, I think you're fundamentally right that we should be very hesitant to rush to make new laws if the existing laws can be used in the way that we need to use them. The problem is, as I think you're kind of getting to there in your remarks, is the existing laws have been interpreted in such a way by the courts as to make them quite restrictive of free speech. And the only way to fix that in our democratic system is for Parliament, where sovereignty ultimately lays as the representative of the British people, to come in and restore the most essential rights and liberties. And if you don't do that through legislation, it's practically impossible to do now that we've got all these legal precedents and we've got the previous laws that are problematic and need to be repealed if we're going to have free speech in this country.
Matthew, could you just quickly sum up what you view as a real threat to freedom of expression posed by the Law Commission's proposed legislation, or an enhancing of legislation, a furthering, a widening of hate crime legislation in this country, and the online harms proposals, as well as I think the Public Order Scotland bill, and what they would actually mean for freedom of expression up and down the British Isles.
Yeah, so part of the reason why we also think that this is the time for UK Free Speech Act is because of all these emerging threats to free speech. And we've identified three major ones on the horizon. So the first one is this online harms white paper that is being put in place by the government for benign reasons. Of course, no one wants online harm. No one wants bad things to happen online. But in the process of removing all harm, the government is wanting to put what they're calling a duty of care on technology companies, but really any company that shares user-generated content. So it could even be a blog by an individual. And they want to make it so that you have a mandate to deal with both legal content, but as well as legal but harmful material. So we're effectively, under these proposals, creating an entire new edifice created and regulated by Ofcom, by a regulator, by a Quango, that will be able to limit speech that is currently legal. So it's not even just trying to say, well, tech companies, you really need to put in more effort to remove illegal speech. I think a lot of people would agree with that when it comes to, let's say, child exploitation or terrorism. It's really expanding where the state's involvement is in online speech. So that's threat number one. Threat number two is this issue we've got with the Law Reform Commission in terms of updating the hate speech laws. Now, as was identified by the Free Speech Union, what they're effectively calling for here would amount to a blasphemy law, something like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. Remember Just Sweet Charlie just a few years ago?
Yes.
That would actually become unlawful in the UK because it could then be considered inciting racial hatred. It would effectively say that if you, by religious criticism offend somebody else, then you are the one who gets in trouble because of their actions. It's a very kind of victim blaming mentality built into there. So that's number two from Law Reform Commission. And then more specifically in Scotland, we have a proposed hate crime legislation bill that is extraordinarily expansive in terms of its scope. So it would, unlike usually these laws, if we were having a private conversation between two people, or even if I just wrote something down on a piece of paper, I was just thinking through an idea, that would be legal speech as long as they're not broadcasting it, even if it was otherwise unlawful. But there's no such exceptions in the hate crimes legislation out of Scotland. So it's effectively creating thought crimes. As soon as you think and write something that they consider to be unacceptable speech, you could be sent to jail or have fines imposed upon you. And then on top of that, it's kind of similar to that Law Reform Commission sense that the definition of hate is just so expansive. So you wouldn't really be able to have debates about things like trans rights issues that are obviously very controversial about what is gender and sexuality. You wouldn't be able to have debates about what is appropriate kind of religious practice. All these kind of very important debates going on in our society would actually potentially become unlawful in Scotland. And that's why there's a really broad coalition of people from the left to the right, from comedians to free market think tankers like me, who are saying that this is hugely problematic. And we're really hoping that the Scottish Parliament will narrow the scope of that legislation proposed by the SNP government up there.
Just finally, Matthew, whilst I've got you here, one big source of concern for me, but I know it will be shared by many people watching us tonight, which is that the way in which big tech, with these what are deemed to be monopolies, I know that the market itself isn't monopolized, they're not state-owned industries or anything like that. Many entrants can enter the market and compete with the likes of Facebook and Twitter, but let's be honest, in the grand scheme of things, that's not going to happen anytime soon. And we find ourselves in the extraordinary position where Donald Trump's tweets can come with disclaimers, which, you know, you might agree or disagree with. I fundamentally think that it's up for the electorate of the United States of America to make those decisions, and not have a tech giant tell them what they should and shouldn't think about a candidate in an election. But putting that to one side, what is the response, the pro-free speech and pro-business response to actually dealing with this problem, where you have what tends to be, let's be absolutely honest, disproportionately conservative thought, which is censored and attacked online?
Look, I think you're right in terms of diagnosing a problem here, which is that the tech companies have increasingly seen themselves, and this is very much a post-2016 phenomenon. So after we had Brexit, we had Trump, and you had the kind of left-wing backlash against that, there was this idea, this myth, that it was all caused by Russian disinformation and people's social media consumption, rather than a willingness to deal with the underlying issues that were at stake and the reasons why people were disillusioned and the reasons why people wanted an ad. Well, exactly. Thanks, Carol. The reason why people were voting for anti-establishment parties. And that kind of filtered through it. It kind of got internalized by the tech companies, as well as by legislators who are putting pressure onto tech companies to do things like fact-checking disinformation, or ultimately the case during the pandemic, removing disinformation. And a good example of this, I think, is the fact that if YouTube had a policy, and admittedly it came in later, if YouTube had a policy in January that said, we're going to use the World Health Organization to decide what isn't acceptable communication about the pandemic, then they would have been removing videos that disagreed with the Chinese position that there was no human-to-human transmission. They would have been removing videos that were pro-mask at the time, because the official position of most governments at that point was that mask didn't do anything. And the problem is when social media companies start to get in the realm of disinformation and facts. Sometimes there are very clear things that are true and very clear things that are false. But more often than not, the issues that are most important, the ones that we debate about, are far more complex than that, and have a lot more nuance, and mean that there are genuine disagreements and different viewpoints that should be put out there. In terms of what we do about it, I mean, the first thing I think we need to do about it is push back against the government pressure onto tech companies. We do have to realize that these tech companies aren't in a vacuum, particularly in Europe and the UK. They are under extraordinary pressure by politicians. If you tune into a parliamentary committee inquiry on anything online related, you're going to see this alternative universe where literally every problem in the universe is based on tech companies. Tech companies are responding to that in part, and the threat of regulation, like that online harms bill I talked about, or the EU is not very well known about, but the EU put forward a kind of a joint statement that they got all the tech companies to sign up to a few years ago about disinformation. Now, that technically doesn't carry EU regulatory law or any kind of formal enforcement, but the fact that they're using these kind of mechanisms, this kind of pressure, is the de facto threat of law, and that's a lot of the reason why the tech companies start intervening. Unlike some other conservatives, I'm a little bit hesitant about trying to step in to, let's say, you've got this idea about liability exemptions, Section 230. You can have a kind of discussion about that. It's kind of it's a whole ragtag issue of its own. But I'd be very hesitant about trying to legislate for kind of requiring tech companies to publish certain speech. To some extent, we do still have to accept that these are private companies, and they can choose what content they do and don't allow on their platforms. As they are censoring speech, people are looking for alternatives. I think you're being a little bit too pessimistic there, Darren. I think you're a fantastic example of this, of someone who's broadcasting an alternative perspective. And we've got a social media company like Parler that's got millions of users as an alternative to Facebook and Twitter. There's nothing necessarily cemented about any individual tech company, and they're all super competitive. And I do want to try to emphasize here that I think the best solution to this is innovation. And the reason why I said that as well is because I worry that if people who are on the conservative side of politics start thinking that they want to legislate what content can and cannot appear on tech companies, that's only going to empower and embolden the left to do this. It's notable that Joe Biden also wants to remove these kind of Section 230 protection from tech companies that mean that they're not responsible for the posts that you make. And that's because he thinks that's a pro-censorship line to get them to remove material. So I think some conservatives are potentially playing with fire in trying to seek legislative solutions rather than innovative and creative solutions that we can use to get out our message more effectively.
And that's a very interesting point, because the greater the myriad of rules and regulations that tech companies have to jump through, it's going to be the massive ones like Facebook that are able to actually take on the cost burden of those new rules and regulations, and the smaller market entrants will just be entirely priced out altogether.
That's absolutely right, and that's actually a key point when it comes to. I'll just explain quickly what Section 230 is, which is this idea that you should a tech company like a bookstore. So for a bookstore, you don't require them to be legally liable for the books that they carry. So if a book is defamatory, you don't sue the bookstore, you sue the publisher or you sue the writer. And it's that same principle online, which is that if I post something defamatory about you, Darren, you can't necessarily straight away sue Facebook. You have to come to me, you have to sue me. And that means that Facebook and Google and Wikipedia, for example, can all host lots of people's edited content and people's self-made, self-generated content without coming under the liability as publishers that would just be outrageously expensive. So these tech companies couldn't exist if they hadn't had that kind of liability exemption, that kind of principle that exists under Section 230 of US law and Article 14 of the EU's e-commerce directive. That's kind of very much a building block of the internet. If you remove that building block, more or less, that these tech companies have huge budgets when it comes to being able to moderate their platforms. They're going to be able to deal with the potential legal costs. It's going to be the competitors to Facebook, to Twitter, to Google, who aren't going to be able to deal with it whatsoever and are going to really struggle. You're going to solidify, and this is a kind of a broader story about red tape and regulation. Every additional piece of regulation creates an additional barrier to entry and reduces competition in the market. So if you start playing around with the regulatory situation online, you're not necessarily going to be more pro-free speech. You're probably going to solidify tech company power, and they're in fact going to have to become more censorious because of potential concerns about liability. So I think conservatives are very much misguided when they think that going after tech companies through liability exemptions is the way forward. I think we need to go after them in the market by providing better products and by scrutinizing their actions, actually, because they do need to be accountable to their users, and we as the users do have power, because if we choose not to use them or we choose to complain, eventually it will get through to them.
Very interesting. Matthew Lesh, where can people find you on Twitter?
Just Matthew Lesh, at Matthew Lesh on Twitter. Or
you're one of those. You're one of those lucky people that managed to get their actual name.
I signed up for Twitter at age 16 or something in 2008. It was a fun, nicer place there, right? I swear.
Yeah, I bet it was. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.